The most common place that you're going to come across static images, in my opinion, is going to be mostly marketing sites. A lot of times you need a big background image for your header, or you need to have some type of static illustration or photo that represents the things that you're talking about. When you get into like actual product design with apps that are doing things and there are functions and actions and buttons and links, you'll have maybe some static images, maybe like in some empty states or maybe some initial sign up flows, onboarding flows. Most of the time in apps, it'll just be kind of a single image. It might be a background image, and we'll dive into some of that. But for now, I want to focus mostly on kind of using static imagery in backgrounds and for marketing sites. And this will still apply to backgrounds and app design and things like that. But first of all, let's just take a look at unsplash.com. And let's just kind of talk about some key attributes of things that I like to look for when I might need to use a static image. Now, it's really going to depend on your project, what kind of photos that you need. But for this particular example, let's just assume, okay, we have some type of motorcycle-based image. Okay, so we've got this kind of interesting looking dynamic photo. But let's say I need to use, say we're talking about some kind of lifestyle for motorcycles, and I need to find a background image. This one's kind of cool, but I'm trying to imagine, where would I put text in this image? And this part of the image is not really that interesting. This part is really cool right in here, but the rest is not. So let's just do a quick little search for motorcycles, and let's just kind of check this out. Okay, lots of different types of images here. You've got some that are just kind of an interesting image, but it's maybe lacking a little bit of personality. We know that if people are in the photo, it's going to have more personality. Like this photo says a lot compared to just some windshields. This is kind of cool. This is an interesting, I like the look of that, but the photo is not that interesting. There's not a cool perspective. I do like the perspective of the road, but it's just kind of flat, maybe a little bit not as good. This one's okay, but usually when you're looking for a background image, you need something that's going to work in a bigger landscape type format. This one would work for mobile phones, but whenever I'm working on marketing sites, I like to think of what's going to look best on a desktop first, because oftentimes it's a little bit more tricky to design and create a composition for a bigger desktop than it is on a mobile screen. A mobile screen, you can get away with a lot less design, but when you're working on a desktop, it's maybe a little trickier. So I'm just looking here, trying to find a decent photo. This one's a little better. Let's try to do maybe motorcycle instead of motorcycles and see if we get anything different. Okay, this one's kind of cool, but still not quite that nice. Just looking for one that would work as a background image. And sometimes this can be a really deflating process, like trying to find an actual image. This one actually looks really cool. Every part of this image is kind of nice. You've got a little bit of background blur, and you've got just a really nice image. If you're not going to have negative space to work with, you could imagine maybe putting a gradient in this area and having some nice big text on top of that. So let's go ahead and download this one, and maybe we'll grab a few others just to kind of compare. I'll tell you what, we're gonna go back to this first one that we found. Actually, this one's not too bad. We might have to maybe punch up the colors or crop it maybe slightly differently, but let's grab this one as well. Let's look at this one as well. This one is probably a little bit more interesting. I don't know if I like the face he's making there, but I want to show maybe how we can put this one together as well. So let's download these two. All right, so we've got these downloaded. Show these in the Finder. I'm going to pull both of these, all three of these, into Figma. All right, so we've got 3 different images here. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and create a frame for a MacBook Pro size 1440 by 900 You could go bigger if you wanted to. I like to start at this size. And all of a sudden you can see that our images are way too big for that particular frame. So if we put that in the frame, you can see this is just way too big. So a lot of times I'll just go ahead and scale them all down roughly the same size. And let's just stick these in here. I'll go ahead and create 2 more just so we can have each one of these has its own frame. And you can tell this one got scaled down a little bit too much. All right, so let's give ourselves a little bit of text to work with. I'm just going to type in "let's ride." And for now, I will do enter. Probably, I kind of want to do a condensed typeface. That would be a little bit more, give it a little bit more like "let's ride," like a condensed, tighter, maybe all caps, but definitely more of a condensed typeface. Trying to see if anything condensed would come up. I know I've got a font called Action Condensed that I bought, but this will not be available to you if you haven't bought this font. There's also another one that I bought called Tungsten. That's pretty nice for these types of scenarios. Kind of like this Tungsten a little bit more. This is from Heffler and Company. It's a really cool font. Just kind of a nice, you can see that it just has a little bit more attitude. This particular font on this image, it just kind of has a nice little attitude. And you could imagine maybe we'd stick with all caps and we'll do some type of subtext would go here. And because this one's at 210, maybe we'll bump that to 220 and let's bring this one down to like 40. Maybe this would look better on top. So this text might not actually work, as this is more of a display typeface. So this text might actually need to be something a little more standard, something like that for now. I just want to get these elements in place to show how we're going to start working with this text on this image, specifically the static background. And remember, not all backgrounds are necessarily static. I mean, this one could potentially be it could be dynamic, but it might be based on my decision or the product owner's decision. It's not going to be a user uploading an image right here necessarily. Now, this looks a little bold, a little too bold, and maybe a little large. I just want to get a nice relationship between some of these things. So something like that. So you can see maybe this is our text and we're trying to figure out where can we put this text on this image. Maybe it looks better. Maybe it looks better on this actual like concrete. So maybe we have to bring this over here. And a lot of times you might actually just find yourself playing around with an image and be like, man, it kind of looks cool with a white border over there. Or maybe maybe this ends up being a darker text and you have to use utility gradient to fade this out, because this particular image is just not going to work just straight out of the box. We're going to have to be a little bit more resourceful when it comes to this particular image. So maybe we try to fade it out to white or gray or green or any of these colors that could potentially work. We want to make sure these are the same color. Do 0% right there. So you can tell like this one's just a little bit harder to work with. That's not really looking that great. So I'm not certain. Actually, we have a little more negative space on this side of the image. So let's make it a little larger and bring this back over here, and we'll do this in white again. Maybe we go even larger. Sometimes you have to make an interesting crop on the photo. Like this could be an interesting crop versus just the entire thing being like this. Sometimes cropping it like that could be a little more interesting and a little bit more dynamic. Then you have a lot going on over here compared to the more open space. I'm trying to see how much can I fit in that area. And even still, this is a little bit, the contrast isn't that great. So I'd probably still want to go ahead and put some type of utility gradient on this. And we'd probably do a black to 0% black, and let's make it go from left to right. All right, now we can actually start to play with, should this be full black or could we tone it down? You know, this is 0. This is 0 right here, and 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%. So we don't want to go too dark, but probably I would say right in the 20 to 30% range is looking pretty decent for this particular image. And you can see like this doesn't really work over here. You could also, if there's more negative space on one side or the other, it looks like there might be slightly more negative space here than there is over there. Unless there's a big reason you wouldn't want to do this, you could just choose the photo, hit Shift H and reverse it, and reverse your gradient. And maybe this goes over there. But really, the thing that is helping this work a little better is really just the way that we've cropped this photo. Now, I don't think this is necessarily the best design in the world, but it's just a way to actually start working with this static image and trying to use this image to the best of its ability, because this is the image by itself. So you don't necessarily just have to grab the image and just use it as is. You can scale it and make it bigger and try to find that interesting crop. A lot of the composition of the photo and the way it relates to the entire design, it's going to be really, really important. So that's trying to play around with this image. Maybe let's see if this one can work a little bit better. So already this one just has a really cool feel with there's a lot more depth I feel here, and we'll just copy this down here just so we kind of remember the original image. So the same way that we worked on a crop for that one, what if we try to accentuate that? But actually some of this gravel, the way this pattern is starting to happen with there's a nice kind of interesting pattern there that actually we start to lose the cool factor of this photo if we start to crop it like that, because these trees and this mountain, I mean, it doesn't look that good. This part looks really cool. So actually look how cool this starts to look when we start to crop it like that. And then we have a lot of negative space down here. We could even put it over here. But again, I mean, this is not even necessarily what we're not necessarily trying to do a lot with this. So I'm just going to maybe mix it up a bit, try to go with something different. Maybe it's a little smaller. You'd also have to keep in mind, do you have a navigation up here? Do you have like a little logo with some navigation elements? I'm just kind of roughing this in just to give you an idea of how this photo could work. And sometimes you can even start to blur these photos a little bit just to give yourself a little bit more to work with here. Where's my blur? Let's go choose the photo, effects, and we're gonna go layer blur. So notice how this starts to look pretty interesting when we blur part of it. If we were in Photoshop, we could do more interesting blurs with like a gradient mask. I'll cover a little bit more of the Photoshop techniques in another lesson, but this is just an example of how you can make your text, and maybe now you have your elements, they're starting to line up a little bit. So you kind of create this composition where it's like hit the road with same typeface, but instead of like a magazine style composition, we're starting to kind of frame this photo in a pretty interesting kind of way. And let's move on to this one. We have a completely different type of thing. I'll grab my elements here. Okay, so you can see this one's pretty busy. So this right now, it's just kind of adding into the clutter of the image. The image is really nice, but it is kind of, there's lots of little details. So you would almost have to go more simple with your type on top of this image. So something like that could work, or because this is such a big image, there's a lot of details. Maybe we go huge with the text and send that to the back. Let me ungroup that. I'm gonna send this to the back and then hit group on these two And I'm gonna mask that image and see how that looks. And now I'll play with the size of the image in the text. So that could be another cool way to deal with this static image. And maybe the white background doesn't work as well. And we're starting to play with maybe something in we haven't firmly set our design direction necessarily, but we're just kind of playing with look at all these different ways that we can play with the static image, whether it's kind of coming up with a cool crop or blurring the background, or maybe we do some type of interesting clipping mask with the text. And another thing we can do to the static image, if we're having a hard time finding the contrast in here it's great on this lighter area, but it's kind of messing up over here on the other side. Well, let's just grab this photo and we'll add a little gradient to the actual photo that's being clipped. So we'll add white down here and blur it or pull the gradient up there. Now if we put that at 0, nothing is there. But if we just start to bump it up just a smidge, we could even use this red color in here. Or maybe we kind of repurpose one of these grays. I'm gonna select both colors and play around with the opacity here. You might have to play around with the opacity overlay and then the background color here. You could play around with that some more. Maybe it's really bright. It's really just kind of experimenting with things and not being afraid of making a mistake and just trying to figure out what we can do with this image. So even though this is a static image inside of the text, you could imagine maybe we cycle through a variety of different images inside of the text here. And this could end up being exported as an SVG element, and it could just be an SVG mask over the image, and the image could rotate. You could imagine hovering over the word and maybe the image slides a little bit and it could create this cool effect. And now that we've done that, maybe we try to see what does this image look like inside of there. So I'll just paste this right into the group and you can see that this image looks pretty cool. This image looks pretty cool in here. So remember, this one is really interesting down here at the bottom, not as interesting up here at the top. So we could play around with, if we do something like that, then we're actually kind of getting rid of this area that's not as interesting, because this actually looks really nice. I like that a lot. So you really are at the mercy of the photograph that you're using. When you're using a static photo, you just have to kind of rely on your instincts for what looks good. And you have to think about, okay, how can I actually use this photo and crop it? How can I make the static photo interesting? And even if I'm going to rotate in 3, 5, multiple images, it really has to have like a really good quality of an image, because any of these, if you just kind of pop them in, they're just not going to look quite as good without using a little bit of work. So I'm actually going to just pull this down and show, okay, what if we needed to bring in an image here and we needed to have a bit of a layout. So again, what I'd probably do is create a mask of that size, just like we masked the text there. I'm going to select the rectangle and the image, group it, and then I'm going to put a mask on that back rectangle. That way I can just kind of create an interesting crop. The same way that we created that other crop, I'm looking at these two motorcycles. I don't necessarily want them both leaning the same exact way. That just seems like repetitive. So I'm thinking about, okay, well, this guy's leaning that way. Maybe this one needs to keep leaning that way. And maybe it's more interesting if he's a little bit out of frame. Is that more interesting than this? You know, just you can play around with it. And once you've kind of made these decisions, you don't necessarily have to crop this photo and export this as a crop photo. You could export the entire photo, but maybe you have some XY coordinates that move it around based on the way that it looks good. So there's a number of ways that you could implement this as well. You could definitely talk to your developer, but also looking at these images, again, I'm trying to look at design direction and overall style. Maybe these rounded edges on the crop, maybe it's just not quite working quite as well, but I can still go in here and change this back to action and go with a really bold version of this. So we're gonna make our photo a little larger here. But you can see that has a lot different feel to it than the other one. You could even start to overlay some photos. We're just playing around here with these images and ways to kind of make it more interesting. So lots of different little tricks in here just to kind of play with static images. But I think the biggest point is that you have to use really good imagery. And if the imagery is not really good, you have to find ways to make it appear better than it is on its own. You have to play with kind of the composition, the crop. Are you gonna blur it? Are you gonna mask it? Find a way to make it look really good. Even if you have actual really good photography that was done from a photo shoot, you're still gonna need to pay attention to the composition and how the images relate to each other on the screen and how everything works together from the typeface to the images, and it's gonna kind of all come together based on the direction that your project is gonna take. So for homework, I want you to go on Unsplash the same way that I did and just come up with some type of theme that the same way that we came up with this motorcycle and we chose ride. Just find some topic that interests you and try 3 different images that look really good. Come up with just some kind of fake thing that we just did here and just work on composition, cropping, blurring, different techniques to make those photos look a lot better than they are just kind of on their own. So post your work and I can't wait to see what you come up with.